Laravel Reverb is a first-party WebSocket server for Laravel applications, and it's now 1.0, which means we get to dive in and let's build an application using Laravel Reverb, which means we get real-time access for all of our users across our application on our server. And let's build it from scratch. Why don't we dive in? So this will be a different type of video where you're going to code along with me. So this will be a little bit longer of a video, but we'll be diving into exactly how do you build a Laravel Reverb application, a real-time application, and what are the steps that you have to think about as we build this. So we're going to be using Laravel, we're going to be using Livewire, particularly with Volt, the class-based API, and why don't we get started? So this is the finished product that we're going to build, and hopefully it'll turn out looking a little bit like this when we go through the whole application process. But the user will be able to see other users' mouse on the screen. You can see on the left side this dot of color kind of hovering around, and then every user will be able to turn on and off the switch. So if there's multiple users across the application, they'll be able to see other users' mouse relative to the space and size on the screen, and then also be able to just take turns turning on and off the switch. Additionally, we'll have this active users tag over in the bottom right just to show how many people are on the site at any given time. So there's going to be a bunch of different features that we're using for this application, and then I'll show you how you can build this from start to finish. Okay, I'm going to go into my code folder, and then we're just going to start by saying Laravel new, and we're going to call this build reverb with me. And we're going to actually start with the starter kit, even though we're not going to be using any authentication features for this. I like to start with it just so that we have Laravel and Livewire kind of scaffolded out and kind of installed and ready for us. Again, you can easily not choose it and then install, all of the things separately, but I just like to use it to have a great starter kit. We won't use start mode. We'll initialize the GitHub Git repository, and we'll let this go ahead and finish. We'll use a SQLite database. We'll run the migrations. We'll create it. All right, and then I'll go ahead and go into that folder. So build reverb with me. We'll go ahead and run npm run dev just so we have the dev server hooked up for us. And let's go ahead and open this in our VS Code. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is I just like to get things set up so that we have one Livewire Volt component that we can start scaffolding this out and building this out for us. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove these routes. I'm going to go into auth.php routes, and I'm just going to remove all of these as well because we don't necessarily need them, and I just don't want them in the application itself, so that when we deploy it, there's no authenticated users. Now let's go ahead and in our web, so we have welcome here. So let's go into our welcome. Let's go into our web routes. We have welcome. So we'll go ahead and edit that. Actually, let's go into welcome, and we'll just call this home.blade.php. So we'll go back into our web routes. We'll say this is home. Perfect. And now what we'll do is we'll just kind of gut this out. So I'm just going to remove all of this. And why don't we'll say our toggle switch game. So basically we want a bunch of different users who are connected, who have this web application open on their web browser. They'll be able to toggle it back and forth. So we're going to go ahead and input a new Livewire component here. So why don't we call this, maybe we'll just call it toggle, like toggle switch. So we'll go ahead and say PHP artisan make Volt, and we'll call this toggle. And that's going to, since we selected the Volt class component API, that's going to automatically create a toggle class component scaffolded stub out for us. So what we're going to do is in our web routes, or in our home, I should say, I want to say that this is the Livewire toggle. There we go. And let's go into our terminal and we'll just say herd open. What this is going to do is it's just going to open up that browser because we're using Laravel Herd to run the kind of local development for us, and we'll also use it for our Reverb server, but I'll show you how to set up and run a local version of your Reverb server if you don't have Laravel Herd. The Pro version is what allows you to kind of enable services like Reverb out the gate. Okay, so we have this ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. That way it's just in our browser right here, and we're ready. Perfect. So the first thing I want to do is I want to just get a toggle on the page, and we'll use some. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this, but I'll show the full code in the GitHub repository. Basically, what we're going to do is in this div, we're going to create a new X data. So this is Alpine. And what we're going to do is just set up some local state. So what that looks like is, oops, we'll need some quotations here. So we'll set up some local state, and basically we just want a toggle switch. So, and actually, why don't we go ahead and bind this to Livewire as well. So we'll go ahead and say public toggle switch equals to false. Yeah, there we go. And then we combine and entangle this to the Livewire component. So what that will look like is we just want the local toggle, we'll call it, and we can entangle that to the toggle switch. There we go. That should be good. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the browser. Okay, so flip switch does not exist on component toggle. Oh, I see. That's because I have this on change flip switch method. So we'll go ahead and remove that for now. Okay, so we have just our pure Tailwind CSS, but with an AlpineJS state that is entangling, in this case, just kind of linking the state of the wire method with this Alpine state. And this will come in handy later, because what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this switches first locally before we turn it. Because if you were to think about this, we want every time this turns on and off to be sent to the server. Well, that could get very expensive and also just slow. If you turn it on, you don't want to wait for the server to tell it that it's off, or turn it on and wait for the server to tell it that it's on. We're going to sync it locally first, and then kind of entangle it, which means that first it's going to change it locally, and then it's going to send it off to the server. So this is a great way to do this. Perfect. Why don't we install Laravel Reverb? So we have a toggle switch ready for us to start listening for when this toggle is actually switched on and off. And that's what Reverb is for. It creates the ability to listen and to send events with Laravel Echo specifically, which is the WebSocket extension of Laravel, so that when we turn on the toggle, we can send an event, and anyone who is listening to that event in Laravel Reverb, the Reverb is kind of like the server hosting those events. Anyone who's listening to the event on our server will then be able to do whatever we want to do when that event is listened to. And Livewire also has capability to do this out of the box. So that way we can say, okay, we have these events. Now we'll just listen to them and do something. And we will barely have to leave this Livewire Vault component. Okay, so why don't we install Laravel Reverb? So the first thing I like to do is let's go ahead and go to reverb.laravel.com. And we'll go ahead and read the docs. That's a great way to get started. So installing, we can install Reverb using the install broadcasting command. Why don't we do that? Oops. PHP artisan install broadcasting. Yes, let's install Laravel Reverb. Perfect. And it's as simple as that. Now, if you are wanting to run Reverb locally, you do have to set up a connection with these application credentials, as well as a couple other things that you might need to do. So I would advise checking the docs here. PHP artisan reverb start is what starts that, because I'm using Laravel Herd, we have these connection variables all ready to go. So it's kind of already hosting this Laravel Herd service for us. So why don't we go ahead and grab those environment variables and we'll put them into our code. So we have .env and we'll just pop them down here. Perfect. Now we should set, looks like it already set our broadcast connection to Reverb, which is when we installed that Reverb PHP Artisan installed broadcasting. We're going to install and build the node dependencies as well. And then that should be it. That should be everything we need to do within Laravel Reverb. Again, read the docs if you aren't using Laravel Herd, but it's as simple as after install, running the Reverb start command. Perfect. Okay. Switch still works, but now let's go ahead and hook this up. The first thing that we need to do is we need to actually create an event to listen to. And so the event that we're going to listen to is just, maybe we'll call it, so we'll say PHP Artisan make event, and we'll say this is switch flipped. That's a good way to put it, because what we want to do is anytime that switch, toggle switch is flipped, we could say toggle switch if we want, I guess, but we'll say switch flipped. Anytime this switch is flipped, we need to send an event so that we can listen to it and flip it on the local version of a user's browser. So in switch flip, the first thing that we need to do is this class switch flip, because it's an event, we need to implement should broadcast. And so that's basically just saying that this event is now a broadcasting event. But there's one more thing we need to do. We need to say should broadcast now. And basically what this is going to do, let's pull it in. This is just saying, instead of waiting and automatically sending this to a queue, which is Laravel's default for should broadcast now is just going to push it out immediately. Okay, why don't we in our construct here accept the toggle switch variable, and then we'll say this toggle switch is equal to the toggle switch variable that we pass in. So we're just saying, we'll go ahead and initiate that here. So we have a toggle switch variable, and then this toggle switch is the toggle switch variable that is passed in to the constructor. And then we're going to create a new channel. And why don't we call this the switch channel? Okay, so we'll bring that channel in. That's illuminate broadcasting. And then we'll go ahead and have a public function of broadcast with, which accepts an array. And we will say that this should return the toggle switch of toggle switch. So what this broadcast with method does, it's saying whenever this, because we're accepting this toggle switch here, and then we're setting the toggle switch variable of this event instance to toggle switch to whatever that toggle switch method. In this case, because it's a toggle, we have false or true. And so it's as simple as that. So we don't have to say, we don't have to call this a Boolean. We just have this, it's either true or not true. This broadcast on is saying, we want this event to be broadcast on this channel called switch. This broadcast with is saying, okay, now I want to, when I'm pushing this broadcast out to whoever's listening, I want to actually send the value of the toggle switch. So we're not just listening for it, we're setting this toggle switch value, and then we're broadcasting to whoever's listening the actual value. Okay, so now in our Livewire component, why don't we go ahead and set this up? So the first thing we want to do is, actually set the initial value, because we need to know, is it false or is it true? But then we also need to, when we load the page, we need to say, is this false or is it true? So the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and call the mount command. And again, this is just saying when this component loads, let's go ahead and set the toggle switch. So we're saying that the toggle switch is initially false. And that's true. We want it to be initially false. But why don't we go ahead and set this in the cache as well? And we can use our database driver. We can use Redis for this, but we already have it set. I believe the cache is set to database, and that's perfectly fine. We should be good to, we should be good to set that. So let's go ahead and in our public function mount, why don't we go ahead and first we'll just set, the toggle switch to grab the cache. So we'll say cache and we'll get the toggle switch. And if it's not in the toggle switch, why don't we set it to false? And we're just going to remove this so that because we're kind of doing the same thing here. So let's grab the cache. So we'll say use illuminate support facades cache. Great. And then that should be good. So now why don't we start broadcasting? So if we are to refresh this component, turn it on. Now let's pull up our cache. Okay, so we have the cache, and if we were to refresh that, it looks like nothing's in there. So let's go ahead and see what's not working properly. Yes, and we don't have it in the cache yet because we actually need it we need to actually say when we toggle it, we want it to set in the cache. So right now we just have it automatically set to be false, but we're not actually setting the cache. We're just saying if we don't have, it in the cache, we'll just set the value to false. So why don't we go ahead and set the cache? And what we can do is we can say public function. Why don't we call this flip switch, because we did have that bound to flip switch. So why don't we do that? Flip switch there. There we go. Okay, public function flip switch. And what we want to do is we'll first cache, and we'll just say forever. We'll want to cache the toggle switch, and we'll want to cache it to the value of the toggle switch. And this is probably a good way to set it to false then here, because that way we can say, if the switch needs to be toggled, then we'll set it to true or set it to false, whatever that value is. Okay, and now here's where we can broadcast that event. And it's going to be as simple as broadcast new, and we'll say switch flipped, because that's the event that we created. And we'll say that we want to send with it, because remember, we're sending the value of the switch. So we'll send the value of toggle switch, and we say to others. And this is basically just saying we want to send this to everyone else who is listening, to others. Perfect. That should be good. Toggle switch. Yep. There we go. And do I have the right number of parentheses? I think that's it. There we go. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull in the switch flipped event. And instead of wire switch, why don't we actually bind that to, why don't we actually use Alpine to call this? So that way we can first flip the switch locally like we did before. So we'll just say X on change. We'll say wire dot flip switch. And so this is the benefit of using AlpineJS, because it's so tightly knit with Laravel Livewires. We can say when this changes, then we'll call the Livewire method. So this is a great way of kind of having that optimistic UI of when we push this to a server, we're going to have a couple milliseconds of latency, but we want the switch to feel like it actually switched even before it hits the server. Syntax error. Let's see. Expecting unexpected token. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look. Unexpected token. So this toggle switch to others. Because the parentheses should be there. There we go. Okay. So now let's go ahead and push our error. After restarting the Reverb service in Laravel Herd, it looks like everything's working properly. So why don't we pull up the cache again, because now we should be able to see the cache in our database. So we have the toggle switch, Boolean of 1, turn it off, and we have the toggle switch Boolean of 0. Okay. So everything is working correctly to toggle the cache switch. So why don't we go ahead and make sure that Reverb is set up correctly and we're pushing that event out properly. So again, we have a toggle on the page. Everything is storing this into the database. So if I was to, let's go ahead and maybe we'll duplicate this so we can set it over here. And this is just to show that the cache is working and we have it mounted properly so that we grab the correct state. Because if I was to change this and then over here, I'm going to refresh and it's set properly. Change this, refresh, and it's set properly. Change, refresh, again, stays the same. So we have that working properly, but we don't have to have the user refresh this in every single instance. Well, what would you do if you weren't using Laravel Reverb? Again, Laravel Reverb is a WebSocket server, so that way we can do this in real time or as close to real time as possible. At least eventing it and sending the event in real time and receiving it in real time. And all we have to do is just wait on the delay of the server. Well, a way to kind of fake this in Livewire, for example, would be to say, okay, instead of putting this on mount, maybe I want to, well, maybe I'll change this to public function with, and then I'll return, maybe I'll return toggle switch, which is set to the cache get of toggle switch. And then I could say, yeah, I could say then in here we could wire pull this and we could say every like 500 milliseconds. We actually have to set the toggle switch to get the cache and then we can return the toggle switch variable that we have. So if we were to now refresh this, what this is doing is now waiting and pulling it every 500 milliseconds and it will essentially be in real time, but that's very expensive on our server. What we're doing is every 500 milliseconds, and maybe we could change this to every 1 second. So now it will refresh every 1 second. Bam, bam. You can see how this might be difficult on our server because we have, let's say, 1,000 people on this website. And every single one of them is pulling the server every 500 milliseconds. Okay, it works great, but it's not necessarily something that you would want to do. And this is a Laravel Reverb video where we're looking at actually broadcasting events and doing this all in real time. So let's go ahead and revert everything that we just did. So we'll change this back to public function mount, and we'll change that there. Okay, perfect. So we're sending it to the cache, but we're sending an event as well. But how do we listen to that event? Well, the good thing is Laravel Livewire makes this incredibly easy to do. We'll go ahead and delete this so we just have this page. So what we can do is, we need to listen for when the switch is flipped. And what we can do is put this attribute in Livewire. We can say on, and then we'll say echo switch. Again, that's the channel that we set up in switch flipped. We're listening to this channel. So on echo switch, we're going to listen for the switch flipped event. Okay, now anything below this attribute, it means that we can run this. So we can say public function, we'll say notify switch, we'll say register. Maybe that's a good way. Register switch flipped. And we'll accept the payload, and that's the payload of the event. So that way we know what value it should be set. And we'll say this toggle switch should be set to the payload value. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and change the cache as well, because we want to make sure the cache stays up to date. If anyone joins the website after this switch is switched, you don't want to have to wait for them to have someone else flip a switch or for them to flip the switch. You want it to be real time before anything happens for new users. I did not bring the attribute in for our PHP class. So we want to use Livewire attributes and we'll use the on attribute. So let's check this now. Refresh on both just to be sure. On. Okay, nothing works. And live troubleshooting. Simple as a stray $. There we go. Let's see how that works now. And bam. That was a lot harder than it needed to be, but it just goes to show that sometimes there is a bunch of different smaller things that can come in the way, especially when you're building live. So we have this ready to go. Now, this is a great first step. And we can just call it there. We can deploy this and everything will be working properly. As long as we have our Reverb server started and running, anyone who joins this can then just click around on the website. So how can we take this real-time app, even though it's simple, and apply some more advanced techniques? It's real time. We can toggle the switch and we can see when others toggle the switch as well, but we might not know how many people are toggling it. We might not see when they toggle it exactly. Can we make that a little bit more apparent? Well, we can still use the power of Laravel Reverb to make this happen. What if we start off with first showing others where our cursor is on the screen? Now we're going to be diving into some advanced Alpine and Livewire to make this happen. And we're going to move pretty quick, but hopefully this gives you some tips and tricks of how to continue to use broadcasting, Echo, and Laravel Reverb to make something like this happen for your next project. So first we're going to add a fancy cursor effect for our own user, the person who is viewing the screen. And this will be a great starting point to see how can we get the cursor position for others and broadcast that. This is just kind of a great way to show, okay, hey, here's how to grab the cursor location, and then we'll move forward from there. So there was a great video on what if Pixar made coding tutorials, and it was by a person named Hyperplexed. And so we're going to grab the Canva that was linked from that video. So the video and the Canva is in the description, but it's just this neat little falling star effect with a cursor. Really beautiful, right? So let's go ahead and implement this into our application, and then we'll move forward from there. So the first thing that we're going to do is just grab the JavaScript from that Canva. So we can just grab all of this, and then we're just going to create a new file in our JavaScript folder. We're going to call this, why don't we call it magicmouse.js. We'll just go ahead and paste that in. Perfect. Looks good. Well, yeah, all of that looks fine. So you see down here, we have this star.class name, and this is actually pulling in the font awesome icon that we can have this falling from the cursor. Well, why don't we bring in that CSS import into our application so that way we have these fonts applicable. So in our bootstrap.js, why don't we go ahead and we'll import, we'll go ahead and import /font awesome -free css /all.min.css. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and bring this in through npm. So we can go npm install font awesome, or actually it's fort awesome /font awesome -free. Looks like that is not correct. Let's go ahead. Should be the @fort awesome. There we go. So that's @fort awesome /font awesome -free. Perfect. And then let's go ahead and import the magic mouse so that we can say import, we'll go ahead and import magic mouse. Perfect, because that's our JavaScript file that we just had here. And instead of fa-solid, we can call, I believe it's called fa star. There we go. So that's the star that we're going to be importing from Font Awesome. So it's going to look a little different from that, from this this Codepen right here. But let's go ahead and take a look. So the last thing we need is we actually need the CSS, and we can just go ahead and copy and paste this into our app.css file. Now, why don't we go ahead and look at our thing, and okay, it's looking pretty good, except that is not the not the star. So let's see what happened there. So we have the star, FA star, and why don't we put a FAS as well? Let's take a look what that is. There we go. That looks a lot better. Okay, so everything is still working as we would expect, but now we just have our own single cursor. And this JavaScript file is going to give us a lot of insight as to how we can implement a broadcast to just display and actually broadcast when the cursor has moved. So why don't we handle this piece by piece first? So we have our magic mouse. Now let's actually go into our Livewire and start hooking this up. So if we go into our toggle, let's go ahead and start by, well, first we need to know where the user is. And for that case, we need to know when there is a new user on the page. So in our public function mount, we can say if there is no session that has, why don't we say a user ID, then we can put a user ID to this session for this particular user. And we can use this cool unique ID. So we can say user ID equals user ID. And actually, we'll say this is a unique ID, and we'll call it user underscore true. Okay, so now we can say there's a public user ID. Perfect. And just for security's sake, why don't we say that this is locked? So no one can actually change that ID once it's set. So we can use Livewire attributes locked. Perfect. So user ID, and then we'll also put this into the session. Perfect. Else, we'll go ahead and set the user ID to whatever it was in the session for that user ID. So this is just saying in the user's local session, we'll add this ID. Okay. Now, why don't we start to broadcast or start to actually just grab the cursor, and maybe we can display like the XY coordinates on the screen for that cursor. Why don't we have an array of all of the mouse positions that are going to be displayed on the page? So why don't we say public, we'll say mouse position, or we can say cursor positions. We'll say mouse positions. Well, that'll be equal to an empty array. Perfect. Now we'll go ahead and say, why don't we start with linking that up to our Alpine data? So we have the local toggle, but now we'll also say that there are cursors. So the cursors are going to be entangle the mouse positions. Perfect. Now let's see. Why don't we use Alpine's X4 coordinates to then loop through that cursor's array? So what we can do here is we can set, like maybe after this div, and why don't actually we move all this to a newer div? So we'll set all of this into a newer div. So X data, and we'll just remove this. That way we kind of separate the div from this particular class. Okay. There we go. And then we can set that here. Okay, and now why don't we, underneath here, we can say that there's a template. This is what Alpine can use for our X4. We can say cursors and cursors. And now, yeah, why don't we, so this is what Copilot's kind of sharing with us. We just want to, we don't even want to bind this style. We just want to show, or we want to maybe display out these cursors. So we can just say this, cursor.x and cursor.y. Okay. So now we have like some X and Y coordinates at least displayed. So how can we get those onto the page? Well, why don't we do that in our, JavaScript file? So we can go into our magic mouse, and we already have this handle on move function. Now this is where I think we want to kind of hook into this to make this a little bit work for not just the individual's cursor. So first we want to make sure we do this in relative sizing. So first we want to say, let's get a viewport height and width. So we can say viewport, and we'll say viewport width equals window.inner width. We'll do a viewport height. And now, why don't we go ahead and also, let's see. Why don't we also get the center, because we want the mouse, the cursor, to be relative to the center of the page, because you can see here that our toggle is on the center of the page. So we want every other mouse to be identical to that, because if we were to, resize this, we don't want it to be off the page that you can't actually see. Why don't we go, and what we can do is, let's grab the center. So we can say the center X is the viewport divided by 2, center Y is viewport divided by viewport height divided by 2. And now we can say that the absolute position of the mouse is going to be X is, let's see, we'll say, because we're handling this on move, so we have this E value of E client X and Y, E dot client Y. Perfect. Now we can say the relative position, there we go, is, it's not minus because we need it to be, okay, so it's X, it would be E of client X minus client Y divided by the viewport width of half of the viewport width. So it would be, let's go ahead and remove this then. It would be X is E dot client X center X divided by, and that would be this here, divided by viewport width. And actually it would be viewport width divided by 2. Okay. And then, yes. So client Y minus center Y. Okay. Divided by viewport height divided by 2. Okay. So this should be accurate because now we have the relative position to the cursor, because we have the viewport height, we have the viewport width, we have the center. So now we have the absolute position of the cursor in those X and Y coordinates, but we also have the relative position because we want it relative to the center. And now we're adjusting the new mouse position. Perfect. But we don't want to adjust the last mouse position with the mouse position. We want to do that with the absolute position. Yeah. Okay. Now, we don't necessarily need the mouse position anymore, because what we can do now is show the relative position based off of where that cursor is. So we can say we have create glow. Yeah, we can update the last mouse position based on the absolute position there. Perfect. And we should have the same working mouse. Maybe not yet because we haven't hooked it up yet. So update last mouse position. Yes, create glow for the absolute position. Let's see what we have. And nothing just yet. Okay. We need to create star for the absolute position. Again, because we're changing this for the cursor that's on the page, but now we also want to kind of modify this for any cursor that's going to be on the page for someone else's client. Okay, let's see here. And it looks like we still have absolute position that we need here. Is there any other place for mouse position? Doesn't look like it. Aha, there we go. So we've got that working for that. And we've kind of set up this next steps for what the relative position. Again, this is going to be everyone else's cursors. So this is where we can start broadcasting these elements, broadcasting everyone else's cursors. So why don't we just get this to the Livewire component first? Because we have, we have all of this. If it's moved, this is just all the original JavaScript. We just modified it to also have the absolute position, which is the original mouse cursor. But now we also have a relative position, which is going to be everyone else's cursor relative to the center of the screen. Now, why don't we just push this data, the relative position, to the page first, and then we can start like displaying a cursor for that. So why don't we say if is page active, and we can go ahead and say that page active is going to be true no matter what. So we can say let is page active equals true, because when this loads, the page is active. Someone has loaded this in their client. And why don't we also just set up maybe like a broadcast position. That way we know where the mouse has been. If someone loads it, we need to know where the cursor is at that exact instance. So we can say let last broadcast position equals null. Okay. Now we have if is page is active, and we can say that the last broadcast position is for last broadcast position, and this looks right, not equals to absolute position, except this is going to be relative position dot x relative position dot y. Okay, let me go ahead and wrap this. It's easier to read. Okay. If page active, why don't I also format this with, we're going to say we'll format this with the TypeScript and JavaScript. There we go. Okay. All right. Wrap. Perfect. So if that is true, then, and we should say if the window is Livewire, okay, if Livewire has been loaded, then we'll go ahead and say window.livewire.find, and this is where we can actually find the element that we want to kind of push into this. So we can say document.query selector, and we want to select the wire ID, and we want to get, let's see, wire ID. We'll just grab that itself so that we can get the attribute of wire ID. We probably want to do the move mouse, and that's what we'll call that element. And we want to get the relative position of that. Okay, and we also want to put the last broadcast position into the, yeah, that looks right. Awesome. So everything is looking great there, except it looks like we might have, we might have missed. There we go. So now we can format, and that should look a little bit better. Okay, so we already kind of have set up that this is going to be finding the move mouse wire method. So why don't we create an event that we can use to then dispatch that move mouse method? Because this is just saying anytime a cursor moves, we want to run the move mouse method with the relative position that we're going to kind of pass into that. So actually, before we even create the event, why don't we just create the method, and then maybe we can just display that on the page. So that way we're just displaying, displaying it for the user. So let's go ahead and say in our toggle, because we need a move mouse method or a move mouse function, we can say public function move mouse. And why don't we just go ahead and accept, well, it won't be a payload. It's going to be the position of the mouse. And then we can say, yeah, why don't we just set this, move mouse positions to position. Why don't we see what this does? So, okay, let's go ahead and see template for each mouse positions as position. And why don't we do that? I don't know what that's doing right there. Oh, it's because it's showing it in style. That's why. So we won't use the actual style. Why don't we actually say, change up this class just so we can have something easier to show. So that is doing it a little bit better. Okay, so we are displaying, we are grabbing that cursor, and we are getting the X and Y coordinates. Again, how is this happening? Looks like we're not doing it the exact right way. So because we're probably adding it to mouse positions when we just need to really have only one per user. So let's fix that. But first, let's kind of like recap what's happening here. We have this magic mouse that is getting the relative position. And that's basically every cursor other than yours, because the absolute position is going to be the individual user's cursor. And we're just going to run the move mouse position based off of this window.livewire.find. There's probably better ways to do this, but this is the way that kind of first came to mind and one that I've used in the past. Okay, again, there's better ways to do this because we're just kind of like adding it for every single kind of element. So we have a bunch of elements being added onto the screen. So why don't we fix this? So instead of this mouse positions equals positions, let's go ahead and actually create a user's payload. In this case, we need to make sure that each individual user has their own cursor that's kind of set and being broadcast. So, why don't we say that this is a payload then? And we want to set the user ID to this user ID. We want to set the position to position, and that's the position that the mouse is being pushed into the page by that JavaScript. And we also need to make sure a user has a unique color. So why don't we do this? I've created this function that's a generate random color function. Basically just grabs a random color. I used ChatGPT for this. I am not that smart. So we'll go ahead and say this is public user colors. So we can have that be an array of specific colors for each user. And where we mount and we toggle the switch, why don't we also add to the user colors, we'll say this user ID, and we're going to generate them a random color. Okay, now each person has a random color in the payload. They have a position as well as a color. That looks correct. And then that looks good. So now we can actually display this information. So now we have this payload. So what we could do is if we wanted to display it onto the screen, but for now, let's go ahead and, we'll go ahead and just kind of like comment this out for now. But what we'll do is push this to a new event. So let's go ahead and create one. So we have, let's do PHP artisan make event, and we'll call this mouse moved. Or we could say cursor move. We'll say mouse moved. And there we go. Let's go ahead and go mouse moved. Perfect. Awesome. And now let's, what do we need? We need their user ID, we need their mouse position, and we need their color. So we can say public user ID, public position, public color. There we go. Now, in the construct, we need to accept the payload. That's what we kind of created in that Livewire function. And we just need to set all this. So user ID, position and color. And that looks good. Okay, now we need to broadcast on, why don't we go ahead and name this channel the mouse movement channel. That sounds good. Mouse movement, bring in that channel, and we should be good to go there. Okay, so we have move mouse, and we're broadcasting that now, so we can create a new broadcast. We can say broadcast new mouse moved, and we can set the payload. Because that looks all right, because we're setting user ID here, so we can just bring in the payload and 2 others. There we go. Okay. So now, why don't we get the other mouse positions? Now that we're broadcasting it, we should have that being broadcast. So now how can we accept that and just at least first display those XY coordinates on the page? Well, why don't we first start by, because we need to listen for the mouse movement. So why don't we go ahead and create, maybe we'll do under this switch flipped. We need, yes, on mouse movement. When the mouse is moved, that's that event that we just created. We need to actually create a public function. Why don't we call this, we say register switch flip, so let's do the same thing. Register mouse moved, and we can accept the payload. And why don't we do, let's see what this does. So we can set the mouse positions to the payload. And why don't we just go ahead and again, bring this out. And maybe we can do mouse positions as position, and we'll do, let's see, or maybe we'll even just do, no, that should be, cannot use, because we probably need the actual, like maybe we'll do user ID just to see, just to make sure this is working properly. Mouse move, not found. Class mouse moved, not found. Let's see. Aha, we did not broadcast it. So we need the use app/events/mouse moved. And I think that's not happening because we need to implement should broadcast now. And there we go. Because we actually need to show what's being broadcast. So if we then listen for this, and why don't we go ahead and reset that to this mouse position's payload. We can mouse position that's position. Let's see now. Okay, it's not working just yet. Okay, position, all right, there we go. So it's actually being broadcast because, I mean, we're getting an error, but so why don't we go ahead and dump the payload just so I can know what we're working with. So we have the user ID, we have the position of X and Y, and then we have the color. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. So now we can actually do something with this information. So why don't we go ahead and say, we can say if the payload position is not equal to null, then we can go ahead and set the mouse positions, and we can go ahead and then create the payload here. We can say a payload of a user ID equals payload of the user position, because that's what we're grabbing. And then if it's not set, if is set is not true, then we can set the user colors to the payload user ID. Okay, that looks great. And we'll set the user colors to the payload's ID. Yeah, perfect. This looks good. And then we'll set else. We need to unset the mouse positions. Basically, remove the user ID from the mouse positions if that's not true. This payload right here. Perfect. now we have, is that correct? There we go. You can see here on both sides, we have the X and Y coordinates relative to the center of the screen. Okay, this is looking pretty good so far. Why don't we start to set how many active users there are? Because we know how many cursors there are on the page. So why don't we go ahead and have an update. So why don't we go ahead and have a public active users count. And why don't we also lock this on the page? There we go. Probably need to lock this as well. And we'll lock this and we'll lock this. So all of that should be set because we're not actually changing this. The code itself is changing all this. So this should all still work properly. Toggle switch needs to be unlocked because the user is changing that. That's an input. Okay. So everything else should still work. Why don't we create a new public function of, let's say, update active users count, and we'll just go ahead and say that this active users count should be equal to count of, we can say the mouse positions, and +1, depending on and you as well, because the mouse position is only going to be everyone besides the person who is on the page. So on mount, we can update the active users count, and then on mouse moved, we can also update the active users count. So when we now can display this out, we can just use that kind of, just use this down here. Say active users is the active users count. So we have, you can see here, there's 2 active users because me on the left, and then the person displaying on the right. You can see here that the button still works. The active user is only showing 1 because it's counting the current cursors. And then over on the right, there's a current cursor from someone else and then that person. So that's why you're only seeing 1. And then when I switch this, you see 1, 2, and the same here with 2, 2. Perfect. Okay. But what happens if someone, just like I'm doing right now, clicks away or maybe changes tabs? We don't necessarily want to count them on the page. They're not active. So why don't we add some JavaScript to remove them from the cursor? So why don't maybe in our magic mouse, let's go ahead and do this. So in our magic mouse JavaScript, what we want to do is basically on visibility change, which is an event listener, and on blur, and maybe even then we can say when the tab is focused, we can change the active state of the page. So why don't we go ahead and say, we'll add a document.add event listener. We'll set for visibility change, and we'll go ahead. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so we can kind of add this. What this is doing is we're just saying with visibility change, is page is active is equal to if the document is not hidden. And if it's not, if page active is false and there is a window Livewire, then we'll go ahead and set inactive. This is the new method that we're going to create right now. So let's go ahead and in our toggle switch, we'll go ahead and create a new set inactive is I believe what we called it. So we have public function set inactive, and here's where we're just going to remove the user from the page, from their mouse positions, from the user ID, from the colors, if that person runs that based off of this JavaScript. Again, this is a great way to kind of say, hey, here's my JavaScript file. I'm watching for a bunch of stuff. We could probably do this in Alpine, but I don't want to clutter it up too much, and we have this file ready for us. And since we're already checking for the cursor, we're just saying if this page is not active, we want to run that Livewire method. So we have set inactive, and what we want to do is we want to unset. We want to unset this mouse positions for this user ID. And we want to update the active user count because we want to remove them. And then why don't we also broadcast that mouse move, because now we're broadcasting it to move it. So that should be the case, because we want to broadcast the we're not broadcasting the color here because we're not necessarily setting it, but we do want to set the position of null. I guess we could broadcast the color of null, but we're already kind of doing that with the user ID on the page. So we can go ahead and send that to others. Perfect. This looks correct because we're basically just saying we want to remove the user ID, or we want to remove the position that is active to this user ID. So we want to set inactive. Okay, let's go ahead and refresh this. Looks like I have some incorrect mouse moved. New mouse moved. We have the user ID. Two others. There we go. Undefined array key color. So we can just set color to null. Okay, we have one. Now we switch it, one. Switch it, one. Now there's two. Switch it, one. Now there's two over here. Perfect. Okay, that looks like it's working correctly. But now we actually need to start displaying the cursor on the page, because we still have the coordinates, we still have everything ready to go. But now how do we start displaying the cursor? Now I'm just going to copy and paste everything that I've done for this, but I'll walk us through it. And again, the GitHub repo is in the description below, so make sure to check that out. But basically what we want to do is with that cursor, now we want to just display that. And we're going to be using AlpineJS to do this. First off, what I'm going to be kind of pasting in is what I found was after deploying this to production, because we're checking and emitting a broadcast every single time the cursor moves, there's a lot that it needs to kind of account for. There's a little bit of lag. The cursor movement looks very choppy. So I created this JavaScript to basically smooth out the cursor. So we're setting a smooth cursors variable, and when this Alpine component is initiated, we're basically watching the cursors and setting those values to the smooth cursors value. Now what this is doing is it's basically just looping through it and animating those specific cursors to kind of give just a little bit of delay so that there is a more smooth and fluid movement for those cursors using some animation frames. So again, all of this is in the GitHub repository down below. And now that we have this app.css for the cursor dot, what we're doing here in our toggle is we're setting the background color for that cursor based off of the user colors that we're entangling with this wire.userColors array. So now we can see that cursor, and you can kind of see like the smooth fluidity that this provides. So if I was to pull up Safari, for example, and we'll say build with reverb.test, now we also see this across multiple browsers. So if I was to say, we'll go ahead and bring this down here. So now we have this broadcasted to every single instance of this browser that is accepting this. It works perfectly fine. Okay, here's some bonus content where I'm actually going to deploy what we just built to Laravel Forge, because it makes it incredibly easy to do so. So I already have this domain set up where I'm just going to be using reverb.joshsiri.com. It's a Laravel application, and we're going to go ahead and add our site. And what this is doing is basically just creating a new site on our server. I already had this server set up on Hetzner, and this is actually not even hosted in the US, so this is a EU Hetzner server. I'm going to use a Git repository for the one that I just uploaded, and that's joshsiri/build reverb with me. So we'll go ahead and use that. Build reverb with me. We'll go ahead and refresh it so we have the branches available for us. We won't use a database. And we'll go ahead and install the composer dependencies, and we'll say install repository. Now, once that's running, all we have to do is there's going to be a button available for us to turn on reverb for this site for our server. And then we just have to make sure that we have npm install, npm run dev ready to go, and we should be good to go. Because I've already set up the DNS records for reverb.joshsiri.com, it should be a lot quicker and we can do this real time. So real time for a real time application. Okay, so it looks like everything is working properly. So we'll take a look at our deployments just to be sure, but we'll go ahead and say npm install npm run build. So we'll update that and let's go ahead and deploy now. Okay, so it's adding the composer dependencies, and looks like it ran npm run build there. So it looks like we're good to go. And then in our application, here's where we should be able to turn on. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Now we can turn on Laravel Reverb. So let's set this up. Yeah, we'll say 1,000 concurrent connections. If you are watching this and it's broken, this is probably the reason. I can set this. My Hetzer box is capable of doing a lot more, but we'll just say 1,000 for now. Once that's turned on, it's going to enable and basically set up your server for the recommended requirements for Reverb. If you don't do that, you can go ahead and go, or if you don't use Laravel Forge for whatever reason, it makes it incredibly easy. You can read the docs and there's a whole running Reverb in production section, which basically just says, hey, here's the recommended settings to use Reverb in production. So looks like that's all good to go. You can see here that it set up a new deployment script to restart Reverb every time we deployed this, this site, as well as in our server, we should see a new daemon to basically run Reverb with the ws.joshsiri DNS. So I did set up all that DNS, so it should be ready to go for us. So in our site, I'll go ahead and deploy. Just in case there are any changes, it shouldn't need to be redeployed, but we'll go ahead and deploy anyways. And then let's see what happens. Okay, deployed. Go and pull this up. And pull this up in Safari, so it's a separate browser. You can see here, this is running live in production. So we have this toggle switch that has been turned on and off by this separate mouse, this separate cursor that we see on these screens. If I was to go ahead and switch screens, all of a sudden you can see where this is being shown. So hopefully this is a great primer, a simple look into what WebSockets with Laravel Reverb and Echo and broadcasting all can look for you in your application, but also a more in-depth look as to how you can build something pretty extraordinary with just a little bit of JavaScript with some AlpineJS, some Livewire, and Laravel Reverb. It's all about making real-time use cases for your application.